Hello, this is Mitch Lalonde here with a guy in a band and master of the 1980s music and knowledge. Here we are, Bill Lalonde.
Oh, hello. I'm unaccomplished musician and noted 80s expert, self-proclaimed Bill Lalonde. I'll be answering a series of questions from Mitch today regarding music, the 80s, and how both cultures seem to meld together seamlessly.
Okay, Mr. Lalonde, how does the music of the 1980s compare to the culture of the 1980s?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, Mitch. I think as far as 1980s culture goes and 1980s music, I think you saw the two meld together quite seamlessly. You had situations, things like the rock and wrestling connection with rock and roll music and Cyndi Lauper and the WWF Wrestling Company combine their forces to expand both of their profiles and both of their popularities together at the same time. I think you saw a mixing quite a bit of the culture in the 1980s in music, especially having to do with philanthropy and social issues. There was a big concentration in the 80s on societal issues such as poverty, world hunger, many different causes and charities that were championed by a lot of stars, including music stars. So in the 80s, when you talk about the culture of the 80s and the music of the 80s, you had a lot of seminal moments that came together, like We Are the World. You had things like Live Aid. You had things like Farm Aid. You had things like Sun City. These were all different social situations such as apartheid in South Africa, or world hunger, or the plight of the American farmer. These were all addressed with different songs and different charitable donations by different musicians. So We Are the World was a record that they had made and put out to combat hunger. Live Aid was a giant concert to do this as well, with musicians from all over the world. You had Sun City, again, a bunch of musicians came together, made a charity song, released it on the radio, and the profits from the sale of that song went to fight apartheid in South Africa. So you have a lot of melding of culture and music in the 1980s in that way.
All right, Mr. Lalonde. Since you told me all that information about, the previous question before, do you know what bands in particular have the most impact on the culture and the ones that have the least?
Well, Mitchell, I think when you look at some of the bands and musicians that probably had the most impact with what I spoke to before in the 1980s, a lot of these songs and power records really involved quite a few musicians. So you had an all hands on deck type approach with bands of all genres, from Michael Jackson to Willie Nelson to U2 to Wham to Lionel Richie to Kenny Rogers to, so many different musicians that all kind of gave their expertise and time to participate in these songs. If you had to pick a musician that was probably the most involved, it was actually some of these concerts, like the We Are the World record and the Live Aid concert, was spearheaded by a musician called Bob Geldof. Bob Geldof played in a band called the Boomtown Rats in the early 80s, who was an English gentleman, and he had helped organize quite a few of these charity events and charity records, including not only We Are the World and Live Aid, but also a Christmas record in England called, I believe it was called Band Aid. And you probably hear it every year on the radio, if you still listen to the radio. It's called Do They Know It's Christmas Time at All? That song was actually put out to fight hunger. So if I had to pick somebody who was really on the forefront of this and organizing it as far as musicians go, I would probably say Bob Geldof.
All right, Mr. Lalonde. Since you've answered what bands have the most impact, and how it impacts the culture. Tell me, are there any years or time frames, in particular in the 80s, that have an impact, or like more or less of an impact?
Well, Mitchell, I have to get going soon, but let me answer your last question in conclusion with this interview. If I had to pick a year or a time in the 80s that I would say music and culture and all of these things kind of culminated all together at once, though there are a few different years, if I had to hone in, it seems that 1985 was the year that a lot of this really kind of came together. So, yeah, We Are the World, that record was put out in 1985. Live Aid happened in 1985. Farm Aid was also happened in 1985. It seems like quite a few things right mid-decade there. So, what took us a little while to kind of get rolling seems like midway through the decade, kind of hit our stride and rode that wave right through the end of the 80s. Until times started to change in the 90s, and more apathetic attitudes in society and music kind of started to rear their heads with the birth of grunge and whatnot. But the 80s were a magical, special time in culture, in music, and in the camaraderie of man. So it was an escape from a decade like the 70s, where it was quite a transitional decade after the uplifting 60s and the hippie movements, and then you had your 70s kind of ground everybody down, and I think the 80s, people were really searching for another social connection and a way to come together, and I think generally you'll always find a way to meld society and culture and music together. It seems like music, to use something for lack of a better pun, music really seems to bring people to the dance. I'm Bill Lalonde.